This is my life, call it Chronicles, but you only see half. Monocle, might have to take a little break if the chronic calls, and I'm the best of both worlds, Sonic and Knuckles.
What's up, Wizards? It's Dev from that channel, here today with the first installment in a series on how to evaluate cards, a little tutorial series mostly for newer players. Now, I know that there is some hubris and a little bit of pretension involved in me just telling you how to tell if cards are good or not, but there are some basic rules on how to evaluate cards that are very, very well known depending on what card we're talking about, and this can be very valuable to newer players who often ask, how can I tell if X or Y is a good card? And there are there's a rule set for that in a lot of ways. So let's go ahead and kick it off with the first installment, creatures. How do you evaluate creatures for constructed Magic play? Well, you can't really look at how to evaluate creatures until you look at the #1 most prevalent argument in evaluating creatures, and that is that most creatures die to removal. You've probably heard this at some point or another, the snarky guy at the card shop, well, it dies to removal, and that guy, it turns out, is very often right when we're talking about standard play. There are some exceptions to this, but first we'll go into creatures that protect themselves very well. That's why Aetherling was a big thing in last year's standard. It's why Morphling is one of the most legendary cards in Magic history. It's why people are bending over backwards to get Shore Crasher elemental work, because these all protect themselves very, very well. And there are other creatures, hexproof creatures go into this. It's why Geist of St. Traft is such a huge thing, and it's why, like, Invisible Stalker is loved by so many people and was actually a thing in Standard. Creatures with hexproof protect themselves just naturally, and creatures that are able to blink themselves, like Aetherling and Shorecrasher Elemental to some extent, are also very highly valued in constructed play because they don't die to removal, it turns out, and that is a very valuable thing. But it's good to always remember that creatures that have a way of protecting themselves are much more highly valued than other creatures in constructed play. However, what are some of the exceptions to the it dies to removal rule? We see creatures all the time in standard play that don't necessarily, or that do, die to removal, and yet are still heavily, very, very, very much played. And there are reasons for that. So what are these exceptions? Well, in a broad way, we can say that the reason a creature may still see standard play even though it dies to removal is because it generates value in a broad sense. And a lot of people have heard this term, and especially newer players, sometimes this can seem very intangible. So it's very important to define this term because it gets thrown around a lot by pros and sort of armchair Magic experts alike, and can seem, like I said, just intangible. What exactly does this term mean? It seems very broad. So let's boil it down. Here are the ways that creatures can generate value. One of the better ways in which a creature can generate value is to replace itself, to have a replacement effect. This is why, like, Thragtusk and even Doom Traveler were important cards a year or two back, and it's why Whisperwood Elemental is fine, also because it prevents against mass removal, but because it replaces itself in a lot of ways. It generates value in other ways too. We'll see that with Whisperwood Elemental. A lot of the creatures that see standard play will fulfill one or more of these requirements, and that's why they see standard play. But that's one of the more famous and good ways in which a creature can generate value, is to replace itself somehow with another creature, usually. Sometimes a card, things like that. But if a creature dies and something good happens for you, that is usually highly valued. Another way in which creatures can generate value, I sort of alluded to there. They can draw cards for you. One of the most famous examples of this is Bob, or Dark Confidant in Modern. Creatures that draw cards or generate card advantage for you over multiple turns can be very, very, very good, and that's why Bob sees so much play and has all throughout, his Magic history. So cards that draw other cards or really generate card advantage for you, which is, more than a 1-for-1, Let's say you play him and you draw a card because you played a guy. That's not necessarily card advantage. That is a replacement effect. But let's say that something gives you 2 cards for playing him. That's card advantage because you drew more cards than you played. You ended up with more cards than you played. So creatures like this are always very highly valued. Another way in which a card or a creature can generate card advantage, or just value in other terms, is by creating other creatures. Now, Thragtusk and Doom Traveler sort of do this. That's a replacement effect. But cards like, say, Monastery Mentor or Goblin Rabblemaster, they create other creatures as they stay on the board, and they affect the board state, which is a big thing too. So, creating other creatures is a big thing. Same with Whisperwood Elemental. He creates other creatures at your end step every single turn. So that's generating value, and creatures that do that are very good. They force your opponent to answer them, and they're very big threats. Also, creatures that have an immediate effect on the game, usually through enter the battlefield triggers, can be very good. But they have to, through that enter the battlefield trigger, affect the board state is usually sort of the rule for enter the battlefield triggers. Immediate effect on the game. That's why Necrotal type creatures are usually very good. Reclamation Sage is seeing a lot of play, even outside of sideboards nowadays, because it affects the board state immediately. Titans and Pestromite are very good for this too, in Commander and Modern play. So, creatures that immediately affect the board state, even if your opponent has removal for them, are also very good. Even if they just straight up die to removal, they're always very good, because it's like, even if the guy dies, you played an important spell, more or less. And that's generating value. Another way that creatures can generate value is to retrieve cards from other zones, usually in the graveyard or in your library via a tutor type effect. Snapcaster Mage is a very good example, and so is Eternal Witness. It's why people are saying Den Protector might actually be a card here in this standard or even in Modern. And so that's always very good. Being able to retrieve cards, that's sort of a replacement effect that we talked about. It replaces itself in your hand with, in this case, a card that may be much more relevant. The last way that a creature can sort of violate the dies to removal rule isn't really a generation of value. It's just that if a creature is aggressively costed enough, then it can definitely, circumvent the DTR rule, dies to removal. A great example of this, the most famous probably, is Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf is so incredibly aggressively costed that it can be a 4/5 or a 5/6 even on the third or fourth turn, and so even if they have removal for it, it's a threat that they have to have removal for, or else it'll just take over the game. And creatures like this are very important. Delver of Secrets, Monastery Swiftspear is a very aggressively costed creature, and that doesn't really generate value, but enough aggressively costed guys can win you a game, especially if you've got, aggressively costed guy on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, that's how mana curves work, and then they have to, even if they remove a guy, they have to choose who's the most relevant guy to remove in this situation, and even if they remove that one guy, still 2 other dudes breathing down their neck. So aggressively costed guys often are incredibly important and honestly form the backbone of Standard in a lot of ways, and even Modern. So that's not really a generation of value or anything, but an aggressively costed enough creature can definitely usurp the whole DTR argument just because it has to die to removal or else your opponent will lose the game. As I alluded to before, many creatures we consider good in constructed environments usually fulfill one or more of these requirements. A good example is Siege Rhino. He's incredibly aggressively costed 4/5 trample and has a very effective ability. As soon as he enters the battlefield, you'll gain back a little bit of the life that you lost to aggro, and you'll push aggro into a hard situation. It can swing 2 or 3 turns worth of work that aggro's had to do. A 6-point life swing is very relevant. And on a 4/5 body, all for 4 mana, that's incredibly aggressively costed. So fulfilling one or more of these requirements. Also, Wingmate Rock. Wingmate Rock, aggressively costed. You get 6 power for 5 mana. They both fly, spread amongst 2 creatures, and it's kind of a replacement effect in that it creates 2 creatures to begin with. So 2 Abzan creatures that absolutely are high value in a lot of ways. That's why they circumvent the dies to removal rule. So usually the creatures that we play a lot with in Standard will see more than one of these requirements fulfilled. I want to close out with a sort of an exercise. We're going to ask ourselves if a card is good and use what we've talked about so far to see, maybe, or no, or yes. We're going to ask, is Ojutai good? Dragonlord Ojutai, specifically from Dragons of Tarkir. So it's a 5 mana 5/4. Is that aggressively costed? Well, for flying too, which is a very relevant ability, which we'll discuss. That is about as much as you'd ever want to pay. It's not aggressively costed, but wouldn't want to pay a penny more, so it's a very reasonable cost. There is a dip in toughness. Usually we'd pay 5 for a 5/5 flyer, but that 5/4, that one dip in toughness, will make a small amount of difference, but not incredibly large in the current meta. We'll talk about that. It has hexproof conditionally, but the condition is relatively steep. If you want this card to be your win condition, you're going to have to violate the hexproof clause on this card, basically. Now, hexproof, of course, we've talked about one of the best abilities you can possibly have. The creature doesn't die to removal as long as it has hexproof, but if you want to swing in with a Jutai, it's going to cost you your hexproof. It also, when you do violate the hexproof clause, generates true value. If you can just get it to swing twice and get 2 cards off of it, you've generated actual real card advantage off of this. So, is Ojutai good? Is he good? Depending on what we've learned so far. Well, actually, we can't answer the question yet, and we won't be able to answer it till next week when we talk about a big topic on for evaluating cards, period, and that is the metagame. So let's review. We have learned that creatures that protect themselves are sort of cream of the crop, top of the pops. And they are always going to be huge in standard. That's why Pearl Lake Ancient right now is the preferred control finisher in the format. And it probably will be for a while. It's why cards like Stormbreath Dragon are big in standard, and why cards like Geist of St. Traft were big back in the day, and still are in some formats. Because they protect themselves, and they just leave your opponent with a handful of dead removal that would otherwise be incredibly relevant and help them swing the game back into their favor. We've also talked about how creatures that can generate value are highly valued. That's a good way of putting it. In any constructed format, they create card advantage, they can affect board state, they can leave something behind via replacement effect, they can have a huge effect on the game right as soon as you play them. That forces your opponent to take care of them. So those are the ways in which creatures can circumvent the dies to removal argument. Next week, like I said, we'll talk about the metagame, because even when you know everything there is to know about this card or another, you still have to evaluate the metagame, because there may be cards or entire deck strategies that completely demolish a card, even if it is traditionally good. So stay tuned for that. We'll talk about that next week. Subscribe for that video, and just pop up in your inbox, and you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that. That was a good video. And then that will continue to happen as we do these videos. So subscribe to us. You'll also get deck techs and set reviews and spoiler vids and MTG news and stuff like that. We do lots of stuff on this here channel. We're strictly better at MTG, and I'm Devin from said channel. I'll see you guys next time. Don't forget to comment. Let us know if we forgot anything. Maybe we should have expanded this video series, at least for the first video, because there's a lot more to talk about in evaluating creatures. Of course, we will talk more about evaluating creatures, but let us know if you have any ideas, or if we missed something very big in this video, or if there's something you'd like to know as a new Magic player, or anything like that. We got you back. We're here for you. Leave a comment anywhere in the thing where there's a thing for you to leave comments, and I'll read them. I like to respond to people. I'm pretty good about that. So if you want to know anything, or if you just have a gripe, perhaps, leave a comment. We'll get back with you at Strictly Better. Thanks for watching, guys. Sincerely.